Just a quick heads up, this video contains a stupid amount of flashing imagery, so if you're gonna die or whatever, just click off now, don't take the risk. Thanks. Gargoyle's Quest released for the original Game Boy all the way back in 1990 before society was ready for portable colour. A spin-off to Ghosts and Goblins, the game follows one of the iconic demons from the series, Red Arremer, or Firebrand as he's known in Pigu country. Being a Game Boy title, the premise is incredibly simple. The Ghoul realm is invaded by an army of the differently abled, and Firebrand's goal is to don the mantle of a former villain in order to repel the adjacent evil. Conceptually, two expendable demon armies battling it out for ghoul supremacy is a somewhat unique scenario which had potential to go balls to the wall. Likely due to the hardware constraints and the design focus of the late 80s, the story's barely present, but this actually works to its benefit as the narrative's sporadic inclusion seems like a justification for some of the worse elements. Gameplay manifests in a duality of unnecessary filler and some pretty tight platforming. The Overworld style is top-down padding, largely serving as middleman for the actual content as it strings side-scrolling stages together. Gargoyle's Quest is short, I'm talking 2 to 3 hours, and a big chunk of that playtime is devoted to ticking meaningless story flags, as well as random encounters. Moving around the world randomly triggers arena-based skirmishes where the goal is to dispatch a couple generic enemies. While it is nice that the world exists as a single, somewhat cohesive piece, and there was a clear attempt for traversal to be greater than just a means of connecting levels, random encounters are a tough sell. Dispatching all enemies within these segments grants the player vials, which can be used to purchase more lives, and in a pinch might save you a couple minutes backtracking, if you ignore the time lost from including random encounters. While its inclusion may have been an attempted emulation of Demon War, it's just a distraction from the good stuff. The world contains a couple samey towns, which exist as safe zones from the monotony of traversal, and they house NPCs, but outside the save guy, the life trader, and whatever mandatory flag you've got to tick, it's pretty bare bones. Most dialogue vessels are either stilted attempts at cramming unnecessary exposition in, or signposts, so town trips consist of finding the biggest baddest demon and agreeing to whatever he says. As short as the experience is, Gargoyle's Quest would have benefited from a removal of the world map, instead sticking to the traditional level structure of its daddy franchise, with critical story blurbs between stages if absolutely necessary. It wouldn't impact progression as there's no optional content and the save system is password based, it'd more or less just cut the fat. Speaking of the main series, core gameplay loosely resembles that found in Ghosts and Goblins, but instead of playing as an old bloke in his undies, you play as a fire-breathing demon who can wall jump and fly. Movement's a bit sluggish overall, though it feels intentionally paced to compensate for the lack of screen real estate. Jumping and flying feel quite constrained early on, brutally demonstrating how underdeveloped your demonic abilities are, and as they're incrementally upgraded, stages morph into tight, semi-precise platforming stretches to complement them. This encroachment does make some of the later stages a bit large for the screen, occasionally requiring a leap of faith here or there, but it's infrequent and isn't a huge issue due to how flight functions. Pressing jump in the air enables flight, which is more of a hover as your height remains constant. While airborne, a meter ticks down, and once emptied, you become the subject of gravity once again, with the bar restoring upon touching down or latching onto a wall. Hovering can also be cancelled and reenacted at any point during descent as long as you have meter, which allows for micro corrections to your height. After unleashing his final form, Firebrand's granted unlimited fly, which you'd think would trivialise the game, making it open to skipping large chunks of the stage, but the levels following actually push the concept quite far and consist of controlled labyrinths and vertical ascents to compensate for your newfound horizontal mastery. This change facilitates a focus split between threading the needle on ascent and controlled corrections during descent. For example, wall spikes can be turned into latchable wall platforms with a sticky breath attack, though they're on quite a prompt timer, which can make ascension an intricate jaunt. These stages also feature long stretches without any walkable terrain, and due to the leniency provided by an unlimited flight meter, become entirely wall jump and flight focused. Enemies are also rarely positioned in a perfect breath trajectory, often requiring rapid compensatory movement, which is another way in which the aforementioned micro-corrections manifest. Firebrand has 4 breath attacks in total, beginning with a low-powered fireball and unlocking more variants as he moves through his opponents. There are boomerangs which allow you to shoot 2 at once, and they also break destructible blocks, which is occasionally necessary for progression. Then there are sticky globs, which function like boomerangs but do twice as much damage, and as I mentioned earlier, can stick to wall spikes to create temporary platforms. Finally, we have the Big Daddy Blast, which hits harder than anything else, has a bigger sprite, which I assume means a bigger hitbox, and is required to damage the final boss. Once you get this, you leave it equipped unless you need the auxiliary effects of the other attacks. A large drawback of this system is that encountering wall spikes or breakable blocks requires breath to be switched in the pause menu, which doesn't take a lot of time and isn't even encountered too often, but it does generally happen in more intimate situations, such as while firebrands mid-air or being hounded by ghouls. This leads to a handful of awkwardly implemented obstacles that don't really add anything, though it would have been cool to see less intrusive switching between these attacks to enable a more seamless flow. With that said, the auxiliary breaths are the only ones which can be fired twice, as opposed to the pure damage attacks only allowing a single blast on screen at once. This was likely a compensatory inclusion since they do pop up in finicky situations, and removing the need for strict precision made these sections much more lenient. The developers likely also realised that these obstacles slow down gameplay, so allowing them to be moved through quicker with a faster breath was a means to reduce tedium. Or maybe it was entirely coincidental, because they didn't catch that whole random encounter issue. On the defensive side, Firebrand starts the game with only 2 health, and can upgrade to a maximum of 5. As I mentioned before, the game isn't overly difficult, however it can be unforgiving, especially in the early stages, even though enemies are largely harmless, and most of their behaviour boils down to walk back and forth, and die. There are slight variants to the format, such as airborne boys with protective wings and clan members with shields, but if they're not positioned synergistically with the map design, which a fair chunk aren't, they can be moved past with minimal effort. Bosses aren't too different in that their patterns are simplistic, and even with the slightly sluggish controls, flight makes dodging a breeze, allowing you to focus on a far more severe face-fucking. Firebrand's attacks are limited by how many can be shot at once, but even the selection that only allows a single blast are still overpowered and spammable if you're even remotely close to a larger enemy. As a result, the only bosses who pose a major threat are the final 2, who take their face fucking quite literally. These demonic entities hide their heads in their palms until they think you've disappeared, and when they peek from behind their fingers, you spit in their eye. The hitboxes are modest and finicky, with your breath getting cancelled if it so much as glances an arm hair, but this isn't a huge issue, as again it leans on the concept of micro-correcting your height for the perfect angle. Our boys attempt to damage Firebrand by throwing homing projectiles and blasting separate balls on a set angle in hopes the player will slip up with positioning, as there's only a handful of small platforms to perch on. The monodirectional blasts are for hindering movement between platforms and don't hit the platforms themselves, whereas the homing shots are a prompt for the player to move, forcing them into the preset paths. It's a neat idea in that your potential demise is self-inflicted, however the homing missile can be shot down with the strongest breath attack, so you can sit comfy and take your pot shots in the lowest stakes game of peekaboo ever. They're definitely standout bosses among the rest, but the ease of cheese undermines what would otherwise be engaging, well-designed encounters. Overall, Gargoyle's Quest is one hell of a Gameboy platformer, and I'd recommend giving it a shot, but due to its many bloated flaws, it exists as a passable base for a potentially amazing sequel. Which it would eventually get, but before that came Gargoyle's Quest 2, The Demon Darkness for the NES. When you either subtitle The Demon Darkness, you might initially think, oh shit, they found my old username, but it's actually a name some professionals settled upon about 30 years ago, and it's a prequel. Though it does initially feature a bit more narrative with your starting town getting wiped by ghouls, it doesn't matter because the story elements share a similar fate to the previous title, in that they're sidelined for the real meat. However, unlike the previous title, the NES is capable of displaying colour and features a larger resolution, so the game looks comparatively vibrant and more appropriately scaled. There's nothing quite like the absence of colour to make the NES palette palatable. There's also a bit more of a tutorial this time around, with a short obstacle course that showcases basic mechanics, and a simple introduction stage following. The prepper stage wasn't necessary, but it's a short, relatively safe playground to test mechanics in, and as far as tutorials go, it's inoffensive. Equally inoffensive is the world map, in which the walk speed was doubled, and random encounters are cancelled. The game's better without them, like no shit, but I still reckon it'd be even more better with no world map at all, stringing the stages back to back. There's still a handful of mandatory field encounters, but they're one and done, and repeatable skirmishes do exist for vial farming, but I never found them necessary. Progression is the same as the first title, with empty, pointless towns that exist to get your extra mans, passwords, and whatever mandatory story flags you've got to tick. It's as complex as it has to be, and with a removal of some of the more bloated elements from outside said towns, they're more of a quick pit stop as opposed to a mental health sanctuary. Despite the fine-tuning of the overhead elements, movement in side-scrolling stages seems slower, which may be due to the larger screen size and smaller sprites, but the vertical leap feels unresponsive, almost like the game slows down when Firebrand jumps. In both titles, when Firebrand isn't at the edge of a stage, the camera keeps him centered on both axes, so the Game Boy version feels faster because there's less screen to pan around, and overall the jump has been scaled to fit the resolution. I've watched the comparison footage back so many times, and I can't concretely pin down why it feels worse, but it definitely does. My best guess is that due to the lower resolution, Firebrand hits the peak of his vertical leap faster in the Game Boy version, whereas in the NES title, he's given a mild momentum shift at the apex to make it feel more like a vertical leap, but this also adds about half a second to airtime, which feels like the game is struggling and slowing as a result. It's something you get used to, and after the adjustment period, the loathing turns into more of a simmered dislike, but it is a huge adjustment after the first title. It's not all doom and gloom, however, as Firebrand now has greater control over his wall positioning. In the first title, to jump from a wall, Firebrand would have to perform an outward leap akin to his jump arc, which would require a slight vertical ascent. Attempts to correct yourself when in close proximity to roof spikes or hovering enemies was often guaranteed damage. While it could be argued that someone who isn't a dumbass wouldn't put themselves in a compromised position in the first place, I'm on YouTube, so I'm beyond criticism and always right. Garg 2 added both a flat vertical ascent, where you can hold up and jump and it keeps you as close to the wall as possible without latching, as well as the ability to drop, where pressing down detaches you for a cheeky fall, and neither requires the jump arc. It might seem like a minor addition, but stage design became significantly more involved and precise, and it would be an infinitely worse product without these movement options. Levels have been changed in a big way, and while they expand upon some of the concepts the former dabbled in, it's not all for the better. For starters, despite the resolution bump, there are significantly more leaps of faith, particularly in the first half of the game when the flight duration is limited. Platforming and general positioning are much more challenging, and with the addition of moving obstacles, most of which outpace Firebrand, foresight and patience are necessary when attempting to make even slight progress. It also seems like there's less ground terrain, and more of a focus on sustained flight and wall grabbing, which naturally leads to more airborne and wall-oriented enemies. These often track the player or shoot projectiles in the perfect arc to keep you on your toes, and the way they synergize with maps shows how perfectly constructed most maps are. The leaps of faith are still pretty fucked. Some of the hitboxes are also iffy, but the game's just broken, it's not my fault. My controller glitched, and it has so much delay, there's nothing I could do. At one point in the late game, your eagerness to dispatch airborne enemies is actually used against you in a brutal fashion. During a tricky platform ascent, a lantern ghost tracks the player and awkwardly approaches, and he's quite easy to dispose of. However, should you choose to do so, the entire screen goes pitch black as there's no more light. It's so severe that it even blacks out the user interface in the pause menu, which is some next level shit. All of these smaller elements meld into a set of enjoyably frustrating stages, easily some of the best I've seen in a platformer. It's commendable how far the formative ideas were pushed, but at the same time, it also seems like stage design suffered from hardware constraints, where enemies that go off screen for even 1 pixel respawn immediately, and plenty of levels seem set up to exploit this. The few instances where this is a killer can make the game stupidly difficult, as it requires some tricky maneuvering, but I mean, that's Ghosts and Goblins, right? The only consequence for death is backtracking, but with a lack of random encounters, that's barely even a punishment. In addition to regular enemies being supercharged, bosses also got some necessary tweaks, making them significantly more difficult, borderline unfair at times, but they actually feel like bosses, and not just big enemies. They're faster, far more aggressive at close range to discourage face-fucking, and feature some interesting gimmicks. With their overall speed increase and the longer hang time on jumps, superior reaction times or a vague predictive knowledge of their patterns is almost required for victory. The bosses in the first title don't do much other than slowly move towards Firebrand, which allows them to be led around fairly generous arenas. There's rarely a moment where the player isn't in control. The bosses in the second title are more animated and snappy. They're the masters of their own domain, and Firebrand is merely a participant as he's too sluggish for a close-range kerfuffle, which is an interesting contrast to most platformers where the inverse is true. The first boss is simple, but jumps in an arc and has 2 separate ranged attacks, a 3-directional burst and a ground bouncy ball, which each require decent positional awareness to consistently avoid. Another boss controls the wind, which influences Firebrand's movement. With a spike trap in the center of the room, as the boss inhales, Firebrand's drawn towards it, and once he's sucked his fair share of air, he releases a few subsequent homing projectiles, just as you get your bearings back. It seems like bosses were of a particular focus in the sequel, as they work in conjunction with their environment, and occasionally feature abstract concepts. The boss of the Mirror World can take the form of Firebrand momentarily, and during that period, any attacks against that boss are reflected onto the player. A greater focus was placed on making the player hesitate lest they be severely punished, versus what was effectively running and gunning in the former title. Speaking of, the two final bosses share the same concept as their former incarnations, but this time they're lactose intolerant. They don't replicate the exact design, featuring reworked arenas which allow for more control over movement, but the fact that you've got to do more than just stand still and shoot makes them infinitely better. Gargoyle 2 features the same breath attacks as the original, but it does make one interesting addition, the Whirlwind Breath. These can be shot twice, like their utility brethren. They propel in a short, straight line and can be used as platforms to climb any ascent without terrain, which does introduce some unique traversal opportunities, though it's largely unused for anything meaningful. Whirlwind does damage certain enemies, however I couldn't really test what kind of damage it outputs, as most seem immune to it, and the short trajectory makes attempts much riskier. Their inclusion does speak volumes about the rest of the level design, as they work in tandem with the larger focus on airtime in an ostensible attempt to evolve beyond the ground, but again, it's cripplingly underused. Overall, I'd say that Gargoyle's Quest 2 has its issues, but expands on the former in a satisfactory way with the slightly bulkier hardware used to enhance and refine the experience. Where the first title would be kinder to a less determined player and is still a great experience in its own right, the follow-up refined too much to not say it's objectively better. And it also got an official demake on the Game Boy, so let's talk about that now. Gargoyle's Quest 2 on the Game Boy is basically a shot-for-shot demake of the NES title, sans colour, and with certain allowances made for the lack of screen real estate. As the screen has been shrunk, leaps of faith are more leapier and far more virtuous. Movement speed has also been increased, and enemies can't move as quickly as their NES counterparts, which makes the formerly challenging boss encounters quite trivial. Where the NES version was based on predictive actions, the Game Boy variant features such responsive movement, granting a large enough window to respond to everything with time to spare. Reading that back, it doesn't sound like a negative, but it undermines what made bosses work so well, as they were far greater than the consenting recipients of a fiery blasting. Also, for some reason, the walk speed on the world map is slower, which makes it a bit more tedious, as there's no need for these maps to exist at all. I love the idea of demaking a game, so despite it being worse than the NES version, it was a fun romp for a couple hours, and the extra levels were nice to stumble upon, even if they weren't fantastic additions and their rewards were questionable. There's not much else to say, it's worth a play just for the curiosity factor, but the NES version is far more worth your time. So that's 3 of the 4 Gargoyle's Quest games. The final entry, it's gonna need its own video. Thanks for watching, see you next time.